But before we do that, I wanted to at least point this out to you on the notes right here on the bottom there of the Jesus, not the Jesus box, but the James Ossuary, which is the bone box. And this is pretty interesting. It's a limestone box carved out of stone, and this was only practiced for a period of time. It wasn't Abraham and all the Old Testament people didn't practice this. This was a practice that was a part of culture. Well, for I don't know, I'll say 200 years. I can get more specific if I think about it a little bit more. But for about 200-year period, and it included the time of Christ and a little bit after, a little bit before. And so when you find one of these boxes, there's a picture of it right there, in Jerusalem, you're talking 1st century. That's when it was used. And as you know probably, how they would bury people, at this time, their culture was to put people in a tomb, in a cave, in a cutout. Not like us. They didn't bury them in the dirt. At certain times, they would bury people in the dirt, or bury them in the ground somewhere. You go back to Abraham and Sarah and in Hebron, where they had that the cave of Machpelah that still apparently is still a shrine today. The Muslims control it now in Hebron. But when you go all the way down, you've got a 2000 BC tomb on the inside. And they'd put the bodies in the grave and leave them there. But they'd also continue to put family members in the same grave. So they'd all be together. Like when it says, and he was gathered to his fathers. In my mind, gathered to your fathers mean, well, your fathers have died and gone into heaven, and you're gathered, you go into heaven. But that's probably not what they're talking about. The gathered to their fathers was his bones were gathered and placed with his father's bones in the family tomb. That's Old Testament. But now, around this time, as you know, they'd cut out, and some of us saw, did you guys go up, well, we saw a different place when we were in Israel, but if you go up on Mount of Olives and you go into some of those tombs, those like Absalom's tomb and stuff, or monument, you go in there'd be benches cut out, there's a bench, and then there'd be like in the back, there'd be like little hollowed out areas, little tunnels, like little caves, just enough for a body to set in. There might be several of them in there, and they'd lay the body, they'd just slide the body in there, they'd wrap it up, just like Jesus, the story of Jesus and his burial. They'd wrap him up in some kind of cloth, but they'd also cover it with fragrance, resins and different types of things that would cut down on the odor of the decaying body, and they'd leave it there, and it'd stay there for about a year, and after about a year or so, the flesh had decayed away, someone would return, and they'd gather the bones out of this, and they'd put them into a box. Right here, there's one right there, and this is not even like, you think really that's how they did it? There's not even any question that's how they did it. And they'd be placed in this box and put a lid, and then a lot of times there'd be a name written on it. And there'd be a name engraved on it, and it'd be set over here in this family tomb. There'd just be boxes, like we have coffins, they'd have boxes with bones in it. And on this one right here, let's go back to 1990. In 1990, south of Jerusalem, right where the old city of David, right where you would think it would be, they were doing some excavation work. Had like a bulldozer, I believe. I'm pulling this off the top of my head now. But they weren't looking for anything. They're doing some excavation work, and the bulldozer fell into the ground, caved in. And when it drove over, if it was a bulldozer or something, they fell in to a 1st century tomb. And when they fell in there, it was an undisturbed tomb. And here's all these ossuary boxes sitting around. And they looked at them. Some of them still had bones in them. And in fact, and one of them talks about, well, here it is. I'll just say this. It was the family of the high priest Caiaphas, including his son Joseph and Caiaphas himself. And on one of the boxes, it's got Caiaphas' names with the bones inside. The priest that oversaw Jesus' trial, they found his family tomb. And they found his box with we got his bones. I mean, it's like, isn't that kind of interesting to know that kind of stuff? It's like, well, we don't know if the Bible's true. Well, we can do a DNA test now. Anyway, in 1978, this guy, his name is Golan. You can see his name down in here. This article is written by Herschel Shanks, and he's one of the great scholars in Jerusalem. He's the one who wrote, or writes the Biblical Archaeology. He's the editor of Biblical Archaeology Review. And this guy, Obed Golan, is an artifact collector. And some people, he's not a Christian. He didn't even know Jesus had a brother. Yeah, James had a brother. Jesus had a brother. He doesn't know. He's collecting old stuff. He lives over there in Jerusalem. He purchased this for a few $100s in 1978. And on this box, apparently, you can see where it says right. I'm trying to find where it's James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. That was who was in this box. Now that just, when people found, and the guy had had it since 1978. And it's like, well, that's what it says. And they flipped out. And of course they realized this is impossible. This is too specific. This is a forgery. So they started doing a bunch of tests on it. And first of all, and just in summary, they've been investigating. This has been on the cover of Biblical Archaeology Review a couple of times. It's been in the paper for 10 years. And it right away came out, it's a forgery. And that's what everybody wants it to be. This guy's a fake. And the guy does, it's like, well, they started testing it. And first, this is not debatable. This is a first century limestone ossuary. No question about it. Everyone agrees. The earlier inscription, the first part of the inscription, James, son of Joseph, they can go in and you can look. Now, again, you can read more down into here. Now, I'm not an expert, but there's an aging chemical mechanism. What's it called? I can't remember what it's called.
Carbon dating?
Not carbon dating. No. It's got something like it's panta or something. It's something about something that grows. Do you know, Dr. Long? You know for sure. It's like if it's old, it's aged. And so when you check the inscription, the outside surface of the box has aged, and they can tell how old it is because of the growth, whatever develops on there. And they can tell on the inside of the letters, if they were cut 2,000 years ago, they should have the same growth on it. And the letters, James, son of Joseph, was not cut in 1978. It was cut 2,000 years ago, that earlier inscription. The question comes now when it says brother of Jesus. It's like someone took an original box that happened to have James, son of Joseph on it, and this was the whole court case, and they added brother of Jesus, which is very unique because on an ossuary box, it would be typical to put the person's name and their father's name, because a lot of times that's their last name. But you don't start putting family members' names on. You don't put James, son of Joseph, brother of, what all these, James, son of so-and-so. But to add a brother's name, there's only basically one reason you would add a brother's name, and that is if it was substantial. If it was, it helped identify James, son of Joseph, Jesus' brother. Because Jesus would be more famous than the father, Joseph. If it'd be Jesus. You understand what I'm saying? Because he has celebrity. So that's one thing going for this. It's like Jesus, if James had an ossuary box, most likely Jesus' name would be stuck on it because Jesus was a celebrity. Now, when they tested this, they said that the name a brother of Jesus had been carved in more recently. But when someone else, including Herschel Shanks and others, went back and examined the evidence, and this has been going on in court, they said, no, wait a minute. The people who tested for that, the growth, the development on the limestone, they used a press, like a clay press where they pressed something in to take out, the image, a mold, and the mold itself pulled that growth off of that part of it. You can see how it tore away. He says it was originally there, but when you were testing it, you destroyed the evidence that was on the words brother of Jesus. And that stood up in court, and it's like now they've lost their case. They damaged the text. And so my whole point for this is after 10 years, this came out on November 10th, and if you see towards the very last line, I think it's on there somewhere. It was this week. They took this ossuary box. They took it from Golan, and they've kept it and had him on trial for forgery. He could have been fined, could have ended up in jail for forging documents or forging these antiquities. But you know what they've done after 10 years? You know what they've done? They brought it back and gave it back to him and says, we have no case. So he's now got this box, and after 10 years, if it's a forgery, he needs to be in jail, he needs to be fined, there needs to be something. But they can't. They gave it back and let him walk away. It's back in his house. He has possession of this once again. So this is just a little article I just cut and pasted on here. You can read more about this. Herschel Shanks, the guy that wrote this article, has done some more extensive work on this, and really, in his view and my view, which I'm reading his material, this is the real deal. Now, listen, it's not that hard to imagine, really. I mean, if these things happened in Jerusalem, James, Jesus' brother, according to Josephus and other, not others, but some church historians like Eusebius and others have mentioned it, James was pushed off the Temple Mount right around 63 A.D. The Pharisees pushed him off. He fell off, and we can see where he fell. You can tell how high it was, fell down, and then they beat him with clubs because he didn't die. Well, then he would have been buried around 63. He would have been buried before the Jewish revolts, which began in 66 A.D., and Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 A.D. So, and we know who followed him as the leader of the Church of Jerusalem. He took him across, when the Jewish wars began, he took him across the Decapolis to a place called Pella. And James would have been buried. The box would have been identified. Jerusalem would have been destroyed. And there it would have been. I mean, just waiting to be discovered. And it would just be a burial box. And like we said, we found Caiaphas. So it all makes sense, I think. And that's enough of that. But it's kind of interesting as these things continue to come out. And any comments about that? Any thoughts or questions or concerns about that?
You said there was a lot of when that bulldozer fell through.
Other members of Caiaphas' family, like his son and other members of.
This is the only one that.
This was not in there.
Oh, this was.
This is. I'm sorry. I was telling you two stories. This was actually bought from an antiquities dealer, up, and I think it's in the Muslim Quarter near the Temple Mount. They have a little shop set up there, and there's a picture of the shop, and it was just something that he bought. When people find these things, they bring them in, and they're. It's kind of sad because you don't know where they came from. You can't. If they find them, they bring them, they sell them. But it's a market. So yeah, we don't know where this tomb was at. Yeah, but the Caiaphas tomb, they know. I mean, they found all the relatives. That would be the height. And this box right here is very, very plain, very simple. If you Google, you go home tonight, just Google Caiaphas Ossuary, Caiaphas' bone box or ossuary, and you look at it. It's still a box, stone box, but it's all carved. It's all very delicate, if you want to say that, compared to this. And James, of course, he was Jesus' brother, but he wasn't, a prosperity preacher by any means. They were very, very, humble people they still had jobs, they're still working. In fact, I'm rambling too much, but when the emperor came over, I think it was more like 135, he came over there concerned. This was after the second Jewish revolt. They were concerned about Jesus' relatives because Jesus was the king and there might be an uprising that the population might want to follow this native king. They went over there to find all the relatives of Jesus with the intention of rooting them out, killing them all, getting so there's not a threat to the Roman Empire. And the documents that we've got, the history record, that the people got over there, they found them, came back and says, you don't need to worry about these people. They're farmers. I mean, they've got jobs. I mean, their hands are calloused. They're not royalty. No one's going to follow. No one even thinks about them as royalty. And they said they're not a threat. In fact, I think some of them got brought over to Rome. And when he saw them, he just sent them back and said, never mind. I thought you guys were a threat because you're the descendants of Jesus. And that's something else you can look up more on. Okay.
Is this the kind of box then that is set around just outside the Temple Mount where all the people are buried? Are these kind of boxes or what's there?
No, those would be more modern. Those are more recent.
Right, but that's the same thing as what?
I can't answer that. I think those are coffins. I think those are tombs with coffins inside. But I don't know for sure. Those are more modern way of burying people. This again was more first century, and I don't think they didn't keep doing it. And that's why you can date graves. You want to see? Okay. But that's why you can date graves, and there's certain. You got to figure out how they buried people, and when you find a grave, then you can kind of know where you're at, what you're doing. Jesus, of course, never had one of these. You see? But that's why they had him prepared. They put him in the tomb, wrapped him up in the spices, and that's why Josephus of Arimathea, you can use my tomb. It's like, wow, he gave up his tomb. Well, yeah, I'm not using it right now. I'm not dead. I'm not going to die for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You understand why Joseph of Arimathea wasn't like he's going to make himself a new tomb. Jesus would be laid there. By the time Joseph of Arimathea died, Jesus would be gone. He could be laid on the same stone slab as Jesus was laid on, if you understand what I'm saying. Jesus wouldn't be laying there forever. He'd be there, he'd be put in a box, put on the shelf somewhere, and Joseph would use the same slab, if that makes sense. Okay, it's kind of fun to read, understand some of these burial practices. Then you go back and you read the gospel account, all of a sudden things that seem a little bit strange just kind of all click together. You know, they put him in the tomb, they come back, they put spices around him. Okay, well that's enough of that. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to jump into Colossians chapter 3, verse 1, and I'm going to kind of give you a breakdown, and then we'll look at a few things.